Intense diplomacy ahead of this event has been going on for years. This has been billed as the conference that can save the planet. Its host, the UK Prime Minister, making the point that the city where it's being held, Glasgow, was the place where the steam engine was invented 250 years ago, triggering an industrial revolution that started the climate crisis.
Yes, my friends, we've brought you to the very place where the doomsday machine began to tick. Humanity has long since run down the clock on climate change. It's 1 minute to midnight on that doomsday clock, and we need to act now.
And the warnings of what is at stake here continued. This from the UN Secretary-General.
Our addiction to fossil fuels is pushing humanity to the brink. We face a stark choice. Either we stop it or it stops us. We are digging our own graves.
US President Joe Biden came to Glasgow with, unlike his predecessor Donald Trump, a strong commitment to fight the climate emergency, but without the tools to do so. His green policies depend on a massive spending package that has already been pared back and has yet to pass Congress.
There's no more time to hang back or sit on the fence or argue amongst ourselves. This is the challenge of our collective lifetimes, the existential threat to human existence as we know it.
The president told delegates the eyes of history were on them, but President Biden's own eyes were the subject of speculation on social media. Did he doze off at one point as he listened to the speeches? Here in Glasgow, there'll be 12 days of long, intense negotiations. For this vital conference to be a success, all the stars need to align. But some powerful leaders, like President Xi of China and Russia's President Putin, are not here, and there's not been the hope for momentum ahead of COP26. Over the weekend in Rome, the leaders of the most prosperous nations on the planet met. They said all the right words about the climate, but they didn't take the action that was needed, according to environmentalists.
Living on the front line.
Mia Mottley is the Prime Minister of Barbados, a small island nation that was battered by a hurricane in July.
Code red to the G7 countries. Code red to the G20. Earth to COP, that's what it said. Earth to COP. For those who have eyes to see, for those who have ears to listen, and for those who have a heart to feel, 1.5 is what we need to survive.
The urgency of the situation is obvious, but it's still not clear there's the commitment by all nations to try to fix things. James Bays, Al Jazeera, Glasgow.
Well, our Environment Editor Nick Clark continues our COP26 coverage live from Glasgow. Nick.
Hello, yeah, thanks very much. Lots of bold, impassioned speeches on day 2 of the UN Climate Conference here in Glasgow. But then UN Prime Minister Narendra Modi came to the stage, came to the podium, and just before we go to a clip of his, remember that a key target here is to get all the countries to agree that net zero should happen by 2050. He really changed direction on that and said that he's going for 2070.
India will fulfill 50% of its energy requirements from renewable energy sources by 2030. Between now and 2030, India will reduce its total projected carbon emissions by 1 billion tons. By 2030, India will reduce the carbon intensity of its economy by 45%. And by 2070, India will achieve the target of net zero emissions.
Well, let's explore this further, take this on. We can speak to Peter Betts. He's an associate fellow in the Energy and Environmental Resources Programme at Chatham House. And you were also a former lead negotiator with the EU and the UK, so you know exactly what's what at these climate conferences. So first up, the Indian PM just going for net zero by 2070. They hadn't actually come up with any pledge for carbon neutral at any point, but now they have. But it's 2070, which is 20 years, 2 decades after the target here, which is 2050.
Thanks, Nick. My immediate reaction is actually this is a very positive step by Mr. Modi. You know, I think if you look back a couple of years ago, we only had about a quarter of the world's emissions covered by net zero targets. We've now got 85% of the world's emissions covered by net zero targets. This is an absolutely unmistakable signal, the direction that the world's economy is moving.
But to achieve or to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius in touch, what's it going to do to that? Is it going to scupper the chances of that happening at this conference?
Not at all. I mean, I think when we talk about keeping 1.5 alive, we're not suggesting we're going to solve everything in this meeting. So, I personally attach more importance to the 2030 targets, the targets that countries have to set for 2030. Actually, we've got significant progress there, but nothing like enough. We're going to leave this meeting having made progress, but we are not fully on track for 1.5. So when we talk about keeping 1.5 alive, we mean we make as much progress as we can, and then we come back for more, and we double down on what we've already achieved.
Modi also went on to talk about climate finance and demanding $11 trillion to be made available for developing nations. It's not realistic, is it?
No, I don't think it is realistic short term. I think that clearly developed countries have to deliver on their commitment to mobilise 100 billion a year, and it's regrettable that they did that late. And I know there's discussion about whether it should be met on average over the period up to 2025. But when you talk about these much bigger numbers, clearly, all these emerging economies are going to be investing trillions anyway, developing their economies and building their infrastructure. The objective is to shift that infrastructure investment, which is happening anyway, and make it low carbon and climate resilient. And increasingly, we're seeing it needn't cost more. In fact, it even costs less in many instances. Renewable energy, for example, now much cheaper than coal in most parts of the world.
We've had no new commitments, no further embroidering of China's position. How much of an issue is that?
I think that for me is a much bigger issue and is frankly disappointing. I was quite pleased with the leadership that President Xi showed back in September of last year when he announced a net zero goal for China for 2060. But I really was hoping, as many other observers were, for a significant tightening of China's target for 2030. And we've seen very little, and I find that a disappointing lack of leadership from China.
Johnson, Biden, David Attenborough, all evoking future generations. They're the ones most at risk here. What is the extensive youth movement, the youth activists that we're seeing here, can expect from this conference, do you reckon?
I think a lot of what this conference needs to deliver was done as we came in before we got here. We've got commitments from most of the big developed economies, except Australia, I'm afraid to say, to pretty well halve their emissions by 2030. That's a step forward. We're now seeing some of the big emerging economies make ambitious commitments. That's great as well, but it's clear that we don't have remotely enough yet to put us on track. So we need to bank what we've got. I think we've got some quite exciting sectoral announcements coming in the course of the next week or so on, reducing deforestation, committing to phase out internal combustion engines, phasing out fossil fuel financing, reducing methane emissions. I think these can build on those NDCs, but I do think at the end of this COP, there's going to have to be a conversation, which many of the vulnerable countries are pushing for already, about a much earlier return to the table than 2025. I think next year or the year after, we're going to have to invite countries, particularly those who haven't stepped up to the plate, to consider whether they might be prepared to do some more.
All right, lots of negotiating and battling ahead. Peter Betts, appreciate that. Thanks very much. Thank you. All right, let's move on to the best and the worst when it comes to emissions. Starting off with China, we've just been talking about China. They pump more than 14 billion tons of carbon dioxide, methane and other gases into the atmosphere each year. That's more than all developing countries combined. Overall, China accounts for around 27% of global emissions, followed by the US, India, the EU and Indonesia, although the United States and Europe have been the worst polluters historically. On the other end are Bhutan and Suriname, and they say they've managed to become carbon negative. Well, now we're going to Liberia, to Monrovia. Liberia has struggled to deal with environmental challenges. The 2020 Environmental Performance Index, in fact, ranked it the worst performing country when it comes to sustainability.